Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 5 of our time together. We're going to talk about the Hellenic world. And I'm borrowing a term Hellenic, which was used to describe specifically the classical era Greeks, in order to avoid too much confusion as we change the name. The Hellenic period, and the Hellenistic period. Yeah, see how it's similar it sounds? So instead, we're going to look at it as a semi-continuous Eastern Mediterranean culture, even though there are a lot of differences between the periods and even within the different city-states. So why do we study the Greeks? Well, first off, why do we call these people Greeks? If they refer to themselves in a different term, why do we call them Greeks? What were they, an empire? Were they a kingdom? What were they? Were they something else? And then what kind of government and society did they have? Really, Greeks did. Like we could point to Egyptian society and talk about the government that the Egyptian societies had in the kingdoms. We can point to the city-states of Mesopotamia. We could talk about the Indus Valley civilizations and the Zhao and so on. But what do we talk about when we say the Greeks? Well, in order to start that, we have to go way back to about 3000 BCE when the semi-nomadic group that we're going to call the Hellenes settled in the peninsula that we know as Greece. They're ethno-linguistically related to each other, so they speak a similar language and they have a similar background, ethnic background. And they do settle in what is modern day Greece, modern day Turkey, and some islands initially in the Eastern Mediterranean. They do later spread out and they set up these autonomous city states, these colonies, if you will. And by doing that, they actually spread themselves fairly far and wide. As I mentioned before, they do spread fairly far and wide. We have those little red dots, all of which show different city-states and colonies that were established by the Greeks. That could range all the way from on the far left in Spain on the Atlantic Ocean to the upper right on the Black Sea to the lower right, Narcissus in Egypt. Even Rome has some deep Greek influence, which we'll cover next week when we talk about Rome, but we're not really going to touch on Rome too much this time. So what can we glean from this really early period of Greek history? Well, there are a few sources that we can use that we can kind of sift through and we have to take with a big grain of salt. A good example of this would be the Bible. Biblically speaking, there are oblique references to the Greeks, very, very oblique. And it doesn't really come into play until the Hellenistic period when we talk about let's say, for instance, the Maccabees and Hanukkah. Uh, that is more later in the period, but there are references to the Greeks even that far back. So kind of hard source, not a very good one. What about the Iliad and the Aeneid? The Iliad and the Aeneid are ancient Greek and Roman uh, recreations, kind of alternate histories, what ifs, and historical fiction. We can also look at some Greek mythology in order to understand what their society was like. So if we take all of these and we combine it with what we can find in archaeological evidence, we can arrive at some form of truth. So what we do know about the archaic period, say about 3000 BCE to about 1100 BCE, is that we have two major groups of archaic Greeks that we can look at. First is the Mycenaean Greeks, and these are those migrants who came in, and we refer to them as the Mycenaeans because of the major city-state that dominated the politics of the region, and that's Mycenae. Mycenae is the home of Agamemnon, and from which the Iliad and the Odyssey spawn. It is the warlike nature that these mythologies arise from. And the Mycenaeans lead a kind of confederacy of other city-states that are kept in line because Mycenae is really big and really powerful. The other ones we can talk about are the Minoans. These are also Greeks, but they seem to be indigenous. They may have settled on the island of Crete. They're on the far south of our map, around 5800 BCE. So they've been around for a while, and they have a distinct separate culture that is nonetheless still recognized as Greek. We call them Minoans. We don't know what they call themselves, largely because the person who found them, Arthur Evans, who found evidence of them, named them after the mythical king Minos. Minos, whose beast was living in the maze below the city called the Minotaur, in which Icarus and Daedalus were imprisoned, from which they escaped, that sort of thing. So, and then finally, the Trojans. Although the Trojans aren't really technically Greek or Hellenes, we're going to include them as well because they had such deep and impactful interactions with the archaic Greeks. So this is what we know. The Mycenaean city-states were very warlike city-states that were allied in a loose confederation. And of course, the strongest city-state becomes the leader of the confederacy. They were extremely expansive. They liked to take territory away from other indigenous tribes. A good example of this that survives into the classic period is Sparta. Spartans, the citizens, are actually a very small, very exclusive group that you're born into. It's a kind of caste structure. And they waged war on the people who originally occupied the area that would become Sparta's territory. These were called the Helots. And they became kind of a almost perpetual slave people, if you will. And that's typical of Mycenaean society, that essentially the strong rule the weak. And we know they're warlike, and I'll get to that because of their architecture. Now, the Minoan Greeks, they were really an older society, and initially it was believed that they were a peaceful people, an agrarian people, for a number of reasons. Arthur Evans kind of really idolized these people as kind of a lost potential for humanity. But recent excavations have shown that the Minoans were not really adverse to violence per se. It just didn't dominate a lot of their art and architecture the way it did with the Mycenaeans. So we can see why he might draw that conclusion that they were relatively pacifistic. So the Mycenaeans had these massive stone fortifications around their cities. And when I say massive, I mean truly gargantuan. As you can see in the picture there, there's some normal sized human beings up against some of these big fitted stone blocks that are not native to the area. So it took a lot of manpower to move them in place. It took a lot of skill to fit them without mortar. And it also tells us not only did they have a lot of money, they had a lot of power, but they were also extremely paranoid of their neighbors because nothing reinforces the need for strong walls than belligerent neighbors. So we have these massive stone fortifications that historians and archaeologists referred to as Cyclopean stonework, as if the giants of Greek mythology had placed those stones there. But they were more than just walls. They were also a way to display wealth and sophistication. As we see on the picture on the right, there's these two rampant lions whose heads are missing, thanks to erosion and defacing and who knows what else. These lions' heads are missing now, but they signified the aesthetic pleasantness of being in a Mycenaean society. They had artists who were very skilled. They had enough money to pay those artists who were very skilled, and they wanted to display these walls. And if you wanted walls that were sturdy, you probably didn't put a lot of pictures on the outside. Those pictures would get destroyed, those carvings would get destroyed if you were attacked. So the fact that they had these on the outside of the walls lets you know that they were big enough to project their power fairly far. And they were really wealthy. Unlike, or I guess not completely unlike, what we do with a mausoleum, this idea of burying a lot of people in one central place in a very contained space. The Greeks did the same thing. They had burial pits. These burial pits, often the people who were interred in them were, if they were wealthy, were buried with their gold or with their weapons. And so these artifacts tell us not only did they have a lot of money, because if you don't have a lot of money, you're not going to bury people with gold. If you are hurting for resources, you're probably not going to bury people with their swords. So they're wealthy, they're affluent, and they're warlike. And they believed, obviously, in some kind of afterlife, because why else would you bury stuff with dead people? So the archaic Greeks, these Mycenaeans, used a completely different alphabet than we are used to seeing. If you go to a fraternity or a sorority, you may see Greek alphabets. Well, that's a classical era alphabet. The alphabet that the Mycenaeans used was completely different, and it was called Linear B. This form of writing was adapted from the Phoenicians and was completely lost during the Greek Archaic Dark Age. We do know that the archaic Greeks loved going to war. They absolutely loved it. They went to war all the time, and they may have alternately gone to war with and traded with the Minoans, with the Trojans, with the so-called sea people of the Eastern Mediterranean. Um, there are few contemporary writings, but there are some contemporary writings, particularly of the Egyptians, that talked about the Mycenaeans. Now, there are no writings left over from this archaic period that we can use to reconstruct a lot of their society. There are some stone tablets, there are some clay tablets that are left over, but anything that was like papyrus or something like that, or vellum, would have been lost. And also, we can use that plus the epics of Homer to tell or construct a story that may be fairly accurate of Mycenaean society. Now, these early societies were lost. They collapsed into a dark age, but thanks to the work of archaeologists and historians, we were able to reconstruct it. Now, if you've ever imagined an archaeologist being like Indiana Jones, going in and taking this beautiful golden treasure and running away with it, then you would have fit into the early ages of archaeology. A German scholar and self-appointed archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann uh, sought the lost city of Troy. He was one of the first to say, hey, there might be something here. Prior to him, most scholars dismissed the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey as just stories, not real things, right? Particularly because there's the intervention of gods, there's all sorts of metaphysical stuff going on. So, yeah, let's go ahead and throw it all out. But Heinrich Schliemann used the Iliad and the Odyssey to kind of pinpoint where he thought the lost city of Troy might be. Now, he tended to dig quickly for treasure, and so he was basically a race to the bottom to see where he could find treasure. And so a lot of his findings have been called into question. A lot of his techniques have been roundly decried because he may have destroyed some very important evidence in his madness to get to the treasure. And of course, he saw the treasure that he found, or the things that he found in the site that would eventually be recognized as Troy. He used those as personal decorations. As we have here on the left, that's Heinrich Schliemann's wife posing with a picture wearing a lot of the jewelry that was found in the dig site. So he was very much a fortune hunter and less of an archaeologist. Minos, which we kind of glossed over a little bit, or going to circle back to, is the modern name given to the natives who live on the island of Crete. They had some really startling advancements, and I can see why the discoverer of this, or the rediscoverer of the society, Arthur Evans, admired them so much. They had things like internal plumbing. They had sewers. Their cities were extremely complex with varied architecture and materials. I imagine that a visitor from outside coming to some of these cities on Crete would have felt like they were stuck in a maze, which may have led to the mythology of King Minos' maze and the Minotaur. Now, a lot of what Arthur Evans found, he would later go on to reconstruct. A good example of that is the boxing scene we have in the right here. The darker parts are the bits that were left behind by the society. The lighter parts are the ones that he hired a local artist to paint to fill in the picture. Now, there are some, and actually there are many, who argue that what he did here was actually harmful to our understanding of Minoan society because he reconstructed it. He guessed. He didn't know. And there are some, and especially tourists and tour guides who say that, well, at least this way we have an idea of what it might have looked at. At least it was a way to make the academic subject of uncovering the society something that could be part of world culture. And so there are merits on both sides of the argument. What we can, however, glean is that there were a lot of goddesses that the Cretians, or I'm sorry, that the Minoans um, worshipped. There were relatively few gods. Women seem to have had a fairly robust role in society. They had a lot of athletic games. There was a lot of emphasis on the physical perfection of the human body. A good example would be on the left of bull jumping. It may have been an early form of bullfighting or maybe running with the bulls in Pamplona, where people, acrobats, would leap over charging bulls. At least that's what we think. I keep mentioning Arthur Evans, but and I kind of derided Heinrich Schliemann. Um, Arthur Evans was a British archaeologist who emulated Heinrich Schliemann in his source finding. He used mythology to try to find the most likely place that these Minoans might have lived. Um, and he found ruins that had been buried under feet and meters of soil over the intervening thousands of years. And when he found it, his workers disturbed some of the ruins, and so some of these ruins started to collapse. And so he tried to rebuild these in order to preserve them as he saw them. Uh, in his own way, he was a little bit better than Heinrich Schliemann in that he wanted to preserve them, but also in his own way, he may have destroyed just as much information. So this again ties in that tension between history and tourism. So Arthur Evans named the society he found Minoans. We don't know for sure if that's what they called themselves. This is a modern name we're imposing on the outside. He also tried to kind of reconstruct that mystery or that mythology behind the Minotaur, but it doesn't seem to have actually existed. This may be an amalgam of the religious practices and some of the uh, rumor mongering or mythology surrounding the Minoans. Evans proposed that Minoans lived in peace with their neighbors, and he points to the evidence that there are very few fortifications. And he erroneously believed that a lot of the weapons that he found were dropped by natives. I'm sorry, not by natives, but by invaders who were attacking the natives. He then supposed that given how warlike the Mycenaeans were, they probably invaded Crete, which is theoretically possible. Later scholars, however, believe that the Minoans were indeed warlike, or they were at least capable of defending themselves, and that many of these swords were actually drawn from metal that was mined on Crete. So why would you mine metal on Crete, trade it away, make it into swords, and then have it invade back to you? It's more likely that you're going to use that to make your own weapons. And furthermore, they pointed out that there are cities that existed for a long period of time on warlike fronts that did not have walls. And actually, that the ocean provides kind of a wall in and of itself. It makes it hard for enemy forces to sneak up on you. What most likely happened, and what most likely contributed to the collapse of the archaic period, this ancient period of Greeks, was natural disaster. Most likely the eruption of Mount Thera, which put a lot of ash in the sky. That seems to be the driving force behind what caused Minoan collapse. Um, the Mycenaeans may have fared slightly better, but because of the collapse of trade and also the lack of enemies to continue fighting, their society may have suffered economically. This leads to cities becoming abandoned. It may have also coincided with a ecological disaster such as a drought. We don't know for sure. Same thing with the Trojans. The Trojans don't really disappear per se. In fact, when Heinrich Schliemann thought he found Troy and thought he found the buried treasure of Priam, and he thought, he finally had the answer. He wasn't quite right. If we were to kind of ballpark the estimate of times, the layer that he found was way earlier than the Trojan War would have happened. And there's also evidence that other societies had attacked Troy as well before and after. So there are several successive layers of different periods and different peoples who lived in the same area. About 7 different layers, actually. And the most recent layer was around 500 of the current era. What we do know is that the societies did collapse, and this leads to a dark age around 1100 BCE. This dark age is a period in which a lot of the writing and culture is lost. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. So the major city-states disappear, except for Sparta, Athens, which was a small city-state at the time, would eventually re-emerge. There's a few other small city-states, but the major city-states are gone. So Mycenae, gone. The writing form linear B, as I mentioned before, disappears. It would later be replaced by what is known as classical Greek writing, those recognizably Greek alphabet. But warfare continues. In fact, it seems that warfare became more complex and more refined during this period. So did all learning disappear? No, just the non-stabby people with sharp things part of learning. Eventually, the Greeks do emerge from this dark period as new cities begin to emerge. They emerge around defensible points, usually hills or some kind of promontory that is easy to protect. And this became known as the polis. The polis is kind of like the central part that is very hard to get at. It was a fortification. And then from that defensive fortification, cities grew up as the cities became harder targets. Rampant warfare and banditry became less common, and eventually cities become bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually, large cities emerge, and they were referred to as metropolises or metropolis, meaning chief cities. They were major cities. So, so Thebes, Corinth, Athens, Sparta, those kind of cities begin to emerge. And as those cities emerge, new trade and new agricultural opportunities present themselves, and populations begin to swell. And so that wealth and that trade and that agriculture begins to alter the nature of the Dark Age. And you get the emergence of the classic era of Greece. Classic Greece is a complex subject itself, too. Um, the Greeks had no one uniform way to approach politics or social organization or even economy, but together they have some similarities. Let me highlight some of the difference. Athens was for a time ruled by a tyrant, a king with absolute power. But there was a revolution and it introduced demoskratia, the power of the people. Okay, so or actually rule of the people. Rule of the people around 590 BCE. The Athenians were very close to the ocean and very close to trade networks, ocean-borne trade networks, and so they had a very strong fleet, but a relatively small army. Contrast that with Sparta. Sparta had an oligarchy, this body of elite men called the ephors. The ephors then chose from amongst them two kings, a diarchy, to rule Sparta. And each king had equal power. So one King A could override King B and vice versa. There had to be unity between the two kings in order to do anything. So this idea that the Spartans had one king and would go out and go to war all the time, not really accurate. I mean, the Spartans were good at war, but they were also kind of squeamish about when they would start it. They were very superstitious. As I mentioned before, they were very warlike, so they had a very strong army. But because they were very much landlocked, they didn't have very much of a navy. In fact, almost no navy whatsoever. They relied on allies and colonies to provide them ships. Now, in between the two, in between these two protagonists, we have Corinth. Corinth, which introduces yet another governmental system, monarchy, this idea of a hereditary monarchy. Financially, it was a rival to Athens, and sometimes it was a military ally of Sparta. We could also throw Thebes in there, that was sometimes a military rival to Sparta and a financial rival to Athens, or a financial friend to Athens sometimes. And so here we have the classic Greek era um, region. The Aegean Sea, the Adriatic, and the Ionian Sea were kind of the home base of Greek traders and Greek society. Classical Greek city-states resume that city-state configuration, and it lasts throughout the classical period into the conquest by the Macedonians, by first Philip II of Macedon, and then his son Alexander the Great. It is only after the conquest of Alexander the Great that the Greeks themselves are unified under a single kingdom. Up until then, they're kind of like loose affiliation. Sometimes they would ally with each other. Sometimes they would backstab each other. They would go to war with each other, that sort of thing. But what is true in Greek cities, Greek city-states, is that there was a hierarchy. There were those who were citizens, who were the privileged few. The citizens resided at the top of the social order. Below them, you had residents, people who were free, but they didn't have very many rights. And then, of course, below them was the majority of people who provided labor, and those were the slaves. Slaves could, theoretically, and did, in reality, um, emancipate themselves from the situation, but not all of them. It was a rare occurrence. Slavery usually was for life. It wasn't predicated upon race. In fact, you could have white slaves, black slaves, everything in between slaves working on the same plantation. They are treated exactly the same way. So citizens were a relatively small percent of the population, and there was a heavy reliance upon slavery for labor because really humans are lazy, and if they can get away with it, they'll get somebody else to do their work for them. Citizens enjoy special privileges and responsibilities that vary from city-state to city-state. Let me give you a couple of examples. Sparta. Sparta is probably held up as one of the most iconic Greek city-states. In Sparta, the minority of people living there were citizens. In fact, it was an extremely small percentage and kept deliberately small by certain cultural practices. The majority of people who lived in the territory were helots, or conquered native peoples. The Spartans every year would declare ceremonial war upon the helots and go to war with them. Now, when I say ceremonial war, I mean it was a ritual. It was a ritual bloodbath. The Spartans would put their armies in the field and go attack the helots. Their slaves, their own slaves, and they would wage war on them to keep the population down and to remind them that they were slaves and the Spartans were on top. Now, needless to say, this causes a lot of simmering resentment to the slaves. So the Spartans, ironically enough, by waging constant war upon their own slaves and by their small, deliberately small citizenship body, were always worried about some kind of slave rebellion, which did happen a lot. Citizens could own property and businesses. If you were born, lucky enough to be born into a citizenship, there's also a birth purity test. So when you were born, your mother would take you before the elders. The elders would inspect your body to make sure you have no blemish, no birth defect, nothing. If you had a blemish or a birth defect, your mother was ordered to abandon you in the wild as an infant. So you're just a few days old. They take you out in the wilds and leave you there and walk away, and they didn't think about you at all. Boom, you were dead. If you passed that, if you were physically fine, they would dip you in wine. And that was to check to see if you had the right spirit in your body. If you started convulsing because maybe you got a mouthful of wine, and wine is a toxin, and toxins in infant bodies are extremely bad. If you started convulsing, then you were unfit, you didn't have a right spirit. Your mother would take you out in the wilderness, leave you out there for whatever to come and eat you, and then walk away and try again. So you had a very small percentage that actually continued the line. So you would have a lot of children, and if your child had Down syndrome, or maybe had a cleft palate or anything like that, if they were mute and they wouldn't cry, yeah, that's another reason why you would be abandoned. So a lot of a purging of the gene pool. If you were a boy at about 7 years old, you would be drafted into the army, and you would be paired with an older man who would be your mentor. And you lived your life in the army. You were a soldier from the age of 7 on, and it was an extremely harsh training regimen. It was extremely brutal. Some people didn't survive. Some people washed out. They got injuries, and they couldn't continue on as a citizen, and they would become a resident, where they could become a potter or a cobbler or something like that. And that's true for all the way until you reach actual maturity, right around 14 years old. You were also educated, though, so it wasn't all about fighting. You were also educated in mathematics and philosophy and rhetoric, and you were taught to be brief and witty. Britty, there you are. So brief and witty. And it leads to this term emerging called laconic. If anybody ever says you're laconic, you don't use a lot of words, but when you do use those words, you express a lot of meaning in those few words. For example, when Philip II of Macedon was threatening to invade Spartan territory, he sent a letter to the Spartans. It said, "If I invade your territory, I will smash your armies, I will rape your women, I will burn your fields, and I will plunder your town. So you should probably surrender." Spartans sent back a reply. It was one word, if. And there was a lot of meaning in that word, if. If you invade. That means if you get that far, right? If you're able to do that, yeah, you probably do that. So Spartan life was not exactly the most luxurious of lives. Adult male citizens lived in the barracks, and if you did marry, you spent very little time at home. Usually, you spent time at home to get your wife pregnant, right? And you would go back to living in the barracks where you lived a very simple life, where you had very few attachments. And this leads to a Spartan lifestyle. If you go into an apartment, into somebody's apartment, and they have like a chair, a table, and a bed, and that's it, they have a Spartan apartment or Spartan furnishings. So it's very few and far between. No frills, no pictures on the wall or anything like that. The adults who washed out, as I mentioned before, become motakis or residents. They have some rights, but they don't have any political voice. Women in Sparta, women citizens in Sparta, really had it good. Women, other than marrying men who were typically much older than them, they could participate in a wide range of activities. They could own businesses, they could form social relationships, sexual and non-sexual. They could attend plays, they could attend religious festivals. The only thing they couldn't really attend was the Olympics because that was an all-male sport. It was done in the nude, and any woman who snuck in there would be killed. I mean, that was just kind of a rule. So you couldn't go to the Olympics, but you could do everything else. Let's contrast that with Athens, the Athenian democracy. And you're thinking, wow, it must be awesome to live in Athens. Maybe, depends, just depends, right? About the 6th century BCE, there's unrest that leads to the formation of democracy, or it literally means power or rule by the people. Citizens were required to attend meetings, to vote on every subject, to sit on every jury, to serve in the military. They had a lot of obligations in the Athenian democracy. Elite boys were well educated in philosophy, which also meant that they had access to history, science, astronomy or astrology rather, geography, and military service. Uh, it is from Athens that we get the big three of Greek philosophy: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Athenian life was segregated. Men associated and congregated with men. Usually, you did so in a gymnasium. A gymnasium is kind of like a gym, kind of like a sports field, kind of like a clubhouse with a big sign says "No cootie girls allowed." And the idea was that your human form would be perfected. So you would have debates. For example, you would have intellectual debates. You would have discussions, symposia, which means drink wine and basically debate life, the universe, and everything. You would wrestle, you would run, you would swim, you would get massages, you would have the hairs plucked out of your body so that you would have a nice, sleek form. And when all was said and done, you'd go home. You would go home to your wife. Elite women, compared to Spartan women, had very little rights whatsoever. They were not allowed to socialize very much. They could participate in certain religious events, but they couldn't go to festivals. They couldn't go shopping on their own. In fact, when they appeared in public, if they appeared in public, they had to be veiled head to toe so that nobody could see what they looked like. The veiling was theoretically to prevent people, especially lower born people, residents and slaves, from being envious of the awesomeness of being elite, and to prevent the women from disgracing their families by being raped, by being the victim of a crime. Often, elite women lived in the house of their father until they were about ready to marry. Then the father would arrange a marriage. They would meet their husband on their wedding day. The husband would then transport him transport his wife to their house, where she would occupy women's apartments that were separate from the rest of the house. She would stay there the entire time, pretty much, and she would give birth. And then if she gave birth to sons and the husband died, the mother would then be transported to live in the house of the eldest surviving son. So it was a very a cloistered life, a very controlled life. Now, Greeks had an interesting, or I should say, a more fluid sense of what it meant to be sexually active and what sexuality meant. As I mentioned before, with both the Spartans and the Athenians, women and men got married for one purpose: to procreate, period. That was it. Of course, there were other considerations, usually some kind of social advantage, allying two families. That's typical. But the overriding purpose of marriage was to give birth. That didn't mean that you couldn't masturbate. It didn't mean you couldn't have a homosexual relationship. And having a homosexual relationship did not affect your identity as a man. It didn't make you any less manly. It didn't affect your status as a woman. It didn't make you any less feminine. It just was something that you kind of kept on the down low. It wasn't something that was very widely publicly available. And on top of it, it was always between two consenting adults. Rapists had special punishments for them. I mean, yes, it disgraced the woman, absolutely, but the man didn't get off scot-free at all. Also, child molesters were not tolerated at all. In fact, one of the deepest, most cutting insults you can levy to somebody in Greece is to refer to them as a boy lover. If the child is prepubescent, if they haven't reached majority, right around 13, 14 years old, they can't consent, and therefore you're a child molester. And that is just, it is a vile, deep insult, something that would make you either mortified or maybe even provoke a fight. So manliness was not tied to your sexual partner, especially for warriors. A good example of this would be the sacred band of Thebes. Thebes, as I mentioned before, was sometimes a military rival to Sparta. In fact, the Thebans handed the Spartans defeat after defeat after defeat a lot. But they get a lot less screen time and a lot less publicity for whatever reason. Now, the sacred band of Thebes was made up of paired lovers. You fought side by side with your lover. Now, why would you do that? Why would you fight side by side with your lover? Imagine SEAL Team 6. You have, let's say, 10 guys in SEAL Team 6, and each one of them is a gay pair. Why would you want them fighting side by side with each other? Well, part of it is, of course, you're going to fight harder to protect your partner because you're attached to them emotionally. But also it speaks to the ethics of or the ethos of the sacred band, that they would never take a step backwards, they would never surrender, and they would never show weakness in the face of an enemy. To do so would not only disgrace them, but it would disgrace them in front of the person that they loved. It would unman them. A good snapshot of this is when Philip II does invade Greece and he attacks the Thebes. Most of Thebes has surrendered, but the sacred band of Thebes cannot surrender. They have sworn before the gods that they will never surrender. So they fight and they fight and they fight. And slowly their numbers get dwindled down because Philip has a lot of fighters, and they are using similar tactics. And although the sacred band is really good at their job, they're just outnumbered, right? And while Philip II is watching this, he begins crying. He watches these brave men dying, and he says, "It is such a shame, but they would not surrender. They could not surrender. They would only ever fight, and he can't leave an enemy behind. So when they are all dead, he has them buried, and he has a monument, pictured here on the right, erected to their valor and their manliness, about how just amazing they were. I don't know what he did with the bodies of the men who went up against the sacred band of thieves, but I imagine they had some kind of funeral, but maybe not as honored as the sacred band itself. From the classic era, we get a lot of the basis of our inquiry for the inquiry, rational inquiry of the universe. For example, mathematics. Mathematics comes from the Greek meaning a subject of inquiry. Uh, it actually comes from the word matema, which literally means an area where I'm interested in. And the idea was that mathematics, the use of numbers, and the manipulation of numbers, and the manipulation of uh, of problems and logarithms and um, formulas could reveal the underpinning rules of the universe. And a good example of that is Pythagoras uh, and his use of mathematics, or Archimedes and his use of levers and that sort of thing. They are all based upon mathematical principles. There was also philosophy, or philosophis, love of wisdom. And philosophy was kind of an all-encompassing um, term that included science, medicine, rhetoric, oratory, logic, and history. We also get Greek warfare. Now, if you've seen the movie 300, you would know that, CGI abs are amazing, right? And of course, you've got 300 Spartans holed up like a little hedgehog there, ready to take on the Persians. They really didn't look that way. Now, yes, they were extremely fit, but they looked more like this. They wore sheaths of bronze. They wore a bronze breastplate, bronze shin guards, bronze helmets, and it was indeed this kind of protection that would leave you alive way longer than this kind of protection. The Greek military innovated a new form of fighting and a new form of soldier. The Greek soldier was known as a hoplite. It also referred to the gear that he wore as well. So it was a spear-wielding infantryman with a lot of bronze armor. The gear weighed around 50 pounds, so it was not easy to carry around. They were extremely disciplined troops who would fight in open, flat land whenever possible. They would interlink shields and put their spears through the shields and be able to stab people. This is a formation called a phalanx, and it proves formidable because a lot of the enemies that they were fighting were not very well armored. They were, of course, supported with others who threw things like javelins and slingers and that sort of thing. But those really weren't citizens. Those were rabble. Those are slaves and residents who were kind of drafted into the fight. Greeks also approached population control in a very unique way as well. Whereas other societies would then form kingdoms and just kind of expand and expand and expand, these city-states really didn't uh, find any opportunity to expand into other city-states' territories. So instead, they would send out colonies. Essentially, people would volunteer, and those who didn't volunteer, if there weren't enough volunteers, people were chosen to basically get in a boat and sail anywhere but where they were. They had to sail somewhere. And when they arrived there, they would make a go of starting a new city state. And this would be thousands of people. And they would make a go of it. Some succeeded, some didn't. So it's kind of a crapshoot. You might die in the wilds, you might not. Colonies spread far and wide throughout the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. You had colonies appearing in Turkey, North Africa, Italy, and what would later be known as Spain. Here's an idea of what I'm talking about. Greece and its colonies had a very wide influence on the Mediterranean. Whoop, there we go. Oops. I'm going to go ahead and go through that. All right, so we've come to the end of our lecture on the Hellenes. We're leaving it off at the Classic period. I have not touched on the Greco-Persian Wars, nor have I touched upon the Hellenistic period, the invasions by Philip of Macedon and Alexander. That's up to you. So make sure you read chapter 5, use the sources. And then also I've provided some additional resources to give you a little bit more rounded view. Okay? If you have any questions or if you need any clarifications, please do email me and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. You guys have a great one. I'll see you next week.